Lewis Wall.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this, the third reading of the Vulnerable Children's Bill. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues Rajan Prasad and Jacinda Ardern, who aren't here, who have worked diligently prior to me becoming a member of the Social Services Committee on the passage of this bill. I want to commend the Minister for taking responsibility for a cohort of New Zealand children who are within her area of responsibility. And I can see the rationale for highlighting and ensuring that our most vulnerable children, our children who are encapsulated for whatever reason, particularly within our SIF system, for being targeted, highlighted, and for us supporting and protecting their positive health and wellbeing. I want to start with a few comments based on the Minister's introduction about what a society should do and guarantee for all our young children. I believe a society should ensure all young people who are born in New Zealand have access to the clinical services that are going to ensure that when they arrive here in the world, that they have access to doctors, to midwives, to all the services that will ensure their positive health and development. I believe that our children should expect a free education system here in New Zealand, which starts with early childhood education. I think that the prioritisation, however, from our perspective, needs to occur before our children are born. So from this side's perspective, we think that issues related to housing provision, the quality of that housing provision, making sure that families have adequate income to make sure that they can have a wage relative to the cost of living in this country actually is a context that cannot be denied and cannot be underestimated in terms of that framework around which this whole focus on vulnerable children comes from. Because unless we address the symptoms of society, unless we address why we're having over 150,000 SIFS notifications every year, when nearly 30,000 of those notifications are actually substantiated, this will continue just to be either window dressing or putting band-aids on problems. And so my contribution really is going to focus on, I guess, another prioritisation and another set of things that we could be doing as a government, as a society, to make sure that we don't produce children who are going to end up in our care system. Because the reality of this piece of legislation is what we're talking about is a bill that essentially are about children who will be encapsulated within the state. These are the children who are vulnerable to neglect, to abuse, because they live in circumstances where their parents have got problems. They've got alcohol problems, they've got drug problems, they've got housing problems. And so we're going to assist these children who are in the state care, but I would prefer, and our side would prefer, that we actually focus on ensuring our kids don't end up in the state system. And so we would prioritise, for example, some of the solutions that the group led by Professor Jonathan Boston, put together by our Children's Commission, actually focused on. So their whole mandate was about solutions to child poverty in New Zealand, evidence for action. So some of our prioritisation would be about how do we prevent kids getting in? Well, we prevent kids getting in, and actually they've given us the solutions. There are 6 things that we could do immediately that would make sure that our kids actually get the best start in life and that we support those most vulnerable. So recommendation number 1 is that child support payments should be made to sole parents. So that was the primary recommendation, because we know that children growing up in sole parent households are the most vulnerable. So that would be their number 1 priority. The second priority is to ensure warrant of fitness for all rental properties, because unless our families are within a quality, warm, dry home, then that means they're living in unstable circumstances, they're living in circumstances where their needs can't be met. The third priority was a private-public partnership around microfinancing, because too many of our vulnerable families are living in debt. So they need help in terms of budgeting, they need help in terms of financial literacy. But at the end of the day, if the money that they're receiving it, even if it is a benefit, isn't enough to pay for the rent, to pay for the power, to pay for food on the table, there's nothing that that family can do to get out of that circumstance. They also recommended food in schools, because the reality is a lot of our children, and in terms of the Minister's responsibility, yes, she's responsible for nearly 30,000 kids in SIFS care, but she's also responsible for 180,000 children who are the children of parents who are on a benefit. And that's the greater context that actually we should be talking about. So it's, in addition to the Fonterra sanitarium breakfast in schools, we should be having hot meals. And that's the sad reality in New Zealand today. Our children are hungry and we need to feed them. The fifth priority was about young people, young parents. They should be supported, because we know that that education is a resilience that they need. So a continuation of our teen parent units. And whilst I was in Invercargill last week, I visited a teen parent unit. And the wonderful thing about these teen parent units are that young parents can come together, they can learn to be good parents, but they can also learn together and actually have some dreams and aspirations about getting NCA level 2 and then transitioning on to higher education. And that's what those teen parents units provide for these young kids. It's actually a stable support system, which means they learn to be good parents, their children go to the local early childhood education centre, and they're also on a pathway to a better life for themselves and their children. And the final one was about community hubs. And the whole focus on community hubs was actually about ensuring we had access to those services that the Minister talked about earlier: health services, education services, social services. Now, in terms of a couple of big deliberations and debates we had within the Select Committee, there was one about the requirement of safety checking of people who are paid to work with children. So essentially this bill is going to check people who are paid by government to work with children. What it doesn't do is check people who are working with children who are either voluntary or who are working with scout groups or sports groups or other groups because of the compliance cost. And it was a huge debate within the Select Committee about whether or not all people who work with children should be required to go through some sort of police checking. Because this legislation, in addition to identifying the children at risk, supporting them, protecting them, was also to identify abusers. And that was what this legislation was about. We identify the abusers and then we make sure that we know where they are so we can monitor any form of engagement they have with our kids. I haven't got much longer to contribute to this debate. What I want to finish on is a story from my own electorate, and it is relevant to Melissa Lee's contribution about poverty isn't the primary reason for child abuse. I would agree with that, but people who live in poverty live in stress. And my local police commander told me a story, Mr. Speaker, about what they did over the Christmas period. They identified the 50 families who they've had the greatest family violence interactions with. And what they did was they visited those families before Christmas and they gave them a food parcel. They visited those families after Christmas and they gave them a food parcel. And they said to those families, if you need help, call us. Don't call us before the family violence incident, call us beforehand and we will come and we will support you. And of those 50 families, Mr. Speaker, they only had one incident over the Christmas New Year period. So what that means is actually poverty does contribute to how stressful families are. It does contribute to how adults interact with each other. It does contribute to the consumption in some instances of alcohol, and so for people to dismiss poverty as one of the underlying reasons of why our children are vulnerable it means that they're not in reality. They're not in the reality of the children that we are here to protect. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's with genuine sadness that the Green Party is opposing the